49 years ago, they were just patients in a mental institution on screen. But you'll be stunned when you see what happened to their real lives after the lights went out. Tragic illnesses, collapsing careers, and deaths so quiet. You never even knew they happened. Get ready. You're about to see them again in a way you've never seen before. Jack Nicholson as Randall McMurphy. Jack Nicholson was born on April 22, 1937, in Neptune, New Jersey. At 38 years old, Nicholson played Randall McMurphy, the volatile force who challenged the system in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, 1975. That role launched him into a level of fame and became the turning point that shaped both his career and the chaos that followed in his parental life. His marriage to Sandra Knight had already ended years earlier, but the emotional fractures lingered long after the divorce. The rising intensity of his work, The Shining, 1980, Chinatown, 1974, and his relentless, method-driven preparation kept pulling him away from any stable home life. The collapse of his 17-year relationship with Angelica Houston became one of Hollywood's most painful breakups, especially after Nicholson fathered 2 children with Rebecca Broussard during their separation. As the decades passed, Nicholson's body and mind began to feel the consequences of a life lived at extremes. After filming The Departed in 2006, he began turning down scripts, memorizing lines had become harder, and long productions felt heavier. By the time he retired after How Do You Know, 2010, his world had become noticeably smaller. The man who once commanded a set with explosive energy eventually stepped back, not by choice, but necessity. In 2025, at 88 years old, Nicholson lives quietly in Los Angeles, surrounded by decades of collected art and the rare visitors allowed into his private circle. His net worth, estimated around $400 million, comes from historic back-end deals, including an unprecedented salary-plus-profit arrangement for Batman, 1989, that earned him over $60 million alone. Louise Fletcher as Nurse Ratched. Louise Fletcher was born on July 22, 1934, in Birmingham, Alabama. At 41 years old, Fletcher played Nurse Ratched, the chilling embodiment of control, in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, 1975. The performance transformed her overnight, earning her an Oscar and placing her in a spotlight she had stepped away from for more than a decade. That return to fame, however, would come with a price she rarely revealed publicly. Her marriage to producer Jerry Bick had already begun to fracture long before her Oscar win, strained by the 11 years she spent away from the screen to raise their children. When she returned with Thieves Like Us, 1974, she was thrust into a demanding industry while Bick struggled professionally, adding fuel to their separation. After her Cuckoo's Nest victory, offers poured in, but the tension at home grew sharper, culminating in their divorce in 1977. Her determination to keep working led her to roles in Exorcist II, 1977, and Firestarter, 1984. But each project carried the emotional weight of a life rebuilding itself piece by piece. As she aged, Fletcher leaned further into work to maintain stability, taking roles across film and television, including her acclaimed 6-year portrayal of Kai Wynn in Star Trek Deep Space Nine. The demanding schedule allowed her to reclaim momentum, but the physical strain became noticeable as respiratory problems gradually limited her ability to travel and work. She continued accepting roles: Virtuosity, 1995, Cruel Intentions, 1999, and Shameless, 2011 to 2012, proof that she pushed through discomfort to avoid another career stall like the one earlier in her life. Fletcher died on September 23, 2022, in Mont-du-Ross, France, at 88, leaving quietly after a lifetime of private endurance and public brilliance. At the time of her death, her net worth, about $1 million, reflected decades of interrupted work, modest television salaries, and the financial challenges of restarting a career twice. She rests in the French countryside she adopted in her final years. Will Sampson as Chief Bromden. Will Sampson was born on September 27, 1933, in Okmulgee County, Oklahoma. At 42 years old, Sampson played Chief Bromden, the silent giant who hid unspeakable pain beneath stillness, in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, 1975. That performance launched him from rodeo arenas into Hollywood almost overnight. From that moment, the world saw his strength, but few understood how fragile his life truly was. His marriage to Jill Sampson remained largely private, yet the emotional strain of losing two sons, one to a drunk driving crash and another to murder years later, deepened wounds that work could not heal. During the filming of The Outlaw Josie Wales, 1976, and Poltergeist 2, 1986, he juggled demanding physical roles while his health quietly deteriorated, a contrast made even sharper as he tried to remain a steady figure for his surviving children. The mounting pressure of being one of the few Native American actors with national visibility added another burden. By the mid-1980s, scleroderma began attacking his lungs and heart, shrinking his 260-pound frame to just 140 pounds. Even as his condition worsened, he insisted on continuing cultural work with the American Indian Theater Company, determined not to let illness erase his identity as an artist and activist. His final months were spent preparing for a heart-lung transplant in Houston, a procedure he hoped would grant him more years with his family and with his art. Instead, complications set in, and the hope he carried into the operating room slipped away far too quickly. Sampson died on June 3, 1987, at 53, passing from kidney failure only 43 days after the transplant, and was buried on the reservation where he grew up. His net worth at the time, about $500,000, came from films, artwork exhibited in major museums, and performances that opened doors for Native American representation. Brad Dourif as Billy Bibbit. Brad Dourif was born on March 18, 1950, in Huntington, West Virginia. At 25 years old, Dourif played Billy Bibbit, the trembling young man shattered by fear, in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, 1975. The performance earned him an Oscar nomination and a BAFTA, thrusting him into a spotlight he never expected. From that moment, fame followed him, but so did shadows he fought for decades. His first marriage to Janet Stephanie Charmatz dissolved as fame intensified, and long stretches on stage and film sets left little room for emotional repair. By the time he divorced Joni Dourif in 1986, he was raising two daughters while fighting bouts of depression that deepened whenever work slowed. Roles like Blue Velvet, 1986, and Mississippi Burning, 1988, demanded psychological intensity, often mirroring the inner turmoil he was trying to escape, especially after Chucky's success forever tied his name to darker characters. Though he never revealed major illnesses, the strain of decades playing disturbed figures, and the emotional residue they left, pushed him toward periods of isolation. The pressure grew heavier during the Lord of the Rings era, 2002 to 2003, when global fame returned unexpectedly and forced him back into a spotlight he had long avoided. Even in his later years, fatigue shaped his decisions, influencing his choice to retire from all projects except those connected to Chucky. In 2025, at 75 years old, Dourif lives quietly in Woodstock, New York, working selectively and only when the Chucky universe calls him back. His net worth, around $6 million, comes from decades of film work, recurring television roles, and one of the most iconic voice performances in horror history. He remains a figure audiences never quite forget. Danny DeVito as Martini. Danny DeVito was born on November 17, 1944, in Neptune City, New Jersey. At 31 years old, DeVito played Martini, the jittery burst of chaotic humor, in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, 1975. That small but unforgettable role became the seed of a career that would one day crown him Hollywood's unlikeliest king of comedy. From that moment, fame and turmoil began rising together in his life. His decades-long marriage to Rhea Perlman endured waves of separation that mirrored the emotional exhaustion of his industry work. They split in 2012 after 30 years of marriage, reconciled briefly in 2013, then separated permanently in 2017, yet never divorced, an uncommon bond shaped by age, loyalty, and the 3 children they raised together. As he pushed through films like Twins, 1988, and directed Matilda, 1996, the chronic joint pain caused by Fairbanks disease made each long production heavier than audiences ever realized. Even so, the pressure of independent projects that failed financially only tightened the cracks forming at home. His health struggles never stopped him from working, but the emotional weight of his shifting marriage and the grind of long shoots shaped the quieter version of the man seen off-camera. During Batman Returns, 1992, for example, prosthetics and long hours amplified his bone pain, a reminder that physical limitations followed him into every major role. Still, he pushed into producing with Jersey Films, Pulp Fiction, 1994, and Garden State, 2004. His resilience became its own form of survival, In 2025, at 81 years old, DeVito continues acting on It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, working through age and pain with a comedian's stubborn spark. His net worth, around $80 million, comes from decades of acting, directing, and producing, including long-running royalties from films that defined generations. And yet behind the laughter, his story remains one of perseverance. Christopher Lloyd as Max Tabor. Christopher Lloyd was born on October 22, 1938, in Stamford, Connecticut. At 37 years old, Lloyd played Max Tabor, the rebellious spark who challenged the ward's rigid order in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, 1975. That breakout role set him on a path towards some of cinema's most iconic characters. But behind every burst of eccentric brilliance came a trail of personal upheaval. His 5 marriages painted a portrait of a man searching endlessly for stability, but finding only temporary companionship. The collapse of each marriage, from Catherine in 1971 to Jane in 2005, left emotional dents that deepened the loneliness he often carried between productions. Even during the joyful whirlwind of Back to the Future's success in the 1980s, the strain of maintaining relationships while filming global hits kept his personal life in constant flux. By the time he married Lisa Loiacono in 2016, he had already spent decades rebuilding pieces of himself after each failed union. The emotional stress of these separations compounded during the 2008 Tea Fire, when his Montecito home burned and he lost more than $1 million in damage. Although he remained physically healthy, events like this pushed him toward bouts of anxiety, especially as age made rebuilding slower. Acting in demanding roles such as Judge Doom in Who Framed Roger Rabbit, 1988, and Uncle Fester in The Addams Family, 1991, helped him stay anchored. He kept returning to film and stage, using performance as a way to navigate the emotional aftershocks of his personal life. In 2025, at 87 years old, Lloyd continues to act, embracing late-career roles with the quiet determination of someone who refuses to fade from the craft that saved him. His net worth, about $40 million, comes from blockbuster franchises, television longevity, and real estate investments rebuilt after the devastating 2008 fire. He remains a symbol of resilience in Hollywood, a man whose characters shaped pop culture while his private world survived collapse after collapse. Sidney Lassick as Charlie Cheswick. Sidney Lassick was born on July 23, 1922, in Chicago, Illinois. At 53 years old, Lassick played Charlie Cheswick, the anxious, childlike heart of the ward, in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, 1975. That performance marked the peak of a long. Behind the nervous laughter his characters carried, his own life was unraveling quietly. His personal life remained largely hidden, and without a spouse or steady partner, illness became a solitary battle. Diabetes worsened over the years until complications forced the amputation of his leg, a devastating blow for an actor whose livelihood depended on constant movement between sets. Even as he pushed through Carrie, 1976, and the cult horror film The Unseen, he carried the private fear of losing both health and roles as his condition progressed. By the time he reached the 1990s, the illness had deepened, and his world grew smaller, fewer roles, slower recoveries, and long stretches without work. His brief appearance in Man on the Moon, 1999, became an unexpected return, reminding audiences of a talent that once brought a trembling humanity to every oddball character he portrayed. However, diabetes tightened its grip until every hospitalization felt more permanent than the last. Lassick died on April 12, 2003, at 80, passing from complications of diabetes at Midway Hospital in Los Angeles, and he was laid to rest at Mount Sinai Memorial Park under a simple stone marked with a Star of David. His net worth, approximately $500,000, reflected decades of small but steady character work that rarely brought security. His legacy lives not in wealth, but in the trembling voice and fragile dignity he brought to Cheswick. William Redfield as Dale Harding. William Redfield was born on January 26, 1927, in New York City. At 48 years old, Redfield played Dale Harding, the articulate, brittle intellect of the ward, in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, 1975. He delivered the role with a depth that came from decades of stage mastery. But behind the polished performance was a body already quietly failing. His marriage to Linda Bright brought stability for a brief moment, yet the diagnosis of leukemia during filming shattered their home life. As his condition worsened, the emotional and physical strain pulled him away from his wife and children, leaving Linda to watch her husband lose strength while still trying to work. Roles in Fantastic Voyage, 1966, and Death Wish, 1974, had built him a solid reputation, but the illness made rehearsals agonizing and performances uncertain. Leukemia advanced rapidly, draining him as he attempted to honor his stage commitments and maintain the discipline that defined his career since childhood. The production team on Cuckoo's Nest noticed his symptoms before he did, a chilling sign that cancer had already taken hold. Toward the end, breathing became painful, movement limited, and even speaking demanded effort. Yet he remained committed to his craft, a devotion that both sustained and exhausted him. Within a year of filming, his body could no longer keep pace with his will. Redfield died on August 17, 1976, at 49, from respiratory complications caused by leukemia, and he was buried at Long Island National Cemetery in New York. His net worth, about $200,000, reflected a lifetime in theater and television rather than Hollywood stardom. His death cut short a brilliant stage career, leaving behind a son who would later follow in his footsteps. Vincent Schiavelli as Fredrickson. Vincent Schiavelli was born on November 11, 1948, in Brooklyn, New York. At 27 years old, Schiavelli played Fredrickson, the gentle, melancholy patient whose quiet presence lingered long after the film ended, in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, 1975. His towering 1.97-meter frame and unmistakably mournful eyes made him one of cinema's most instantly recognizable character actors. Yet behind that haunting screen image was a man whose life would be shaped by illness and heartbreak. His first marriage to actress Alice Beasley collapsed under the strain of constant work and his Marfan-related health problems, leaving him emotionally stripped just as his film career began accelerating. Even when he remarried harpist Carol Sue Mukalian in 1992 and built a steadier home life, the shadow of chronic illness never fully left him. His body, challenged by Marfan syndrome since childhood, made stamina difficult during films like Ghost, 1990, and Batman Returns, 1992, pushing him to retreat into writing as a form of refuge. Each cookbook he published, blending memory, recipes, and family stories, was less about cuisine and more about coping with the quiet loneliness illness imposed on him. By the late 1990s, lung damage from years of smoking compounded his Marfan vulnerabilities, forcing him to leave Hollywood and move permanently to Sicily in 1996. Even while filming Tomorrow Never Dies, 1997, he struggled through persistent fatigue, hiding his worsening condition to avoid losing work. The ancestral town of Polizzi Generosa became his sanctuary, a place where he hoped slow living and distance from the industry would buy him more time. But the diagnosis of lung cancer followed him there. Schiavelli died on December 26, 2005, at 57, in the Sicilian home where he had sought peace, and he was buried in the cemetery of Polizzi Generosa. His net worth, about $1 million, reflected a lifetime of steady character work and 3 published books that preserved his family's heritage. Though illness took him early, his legacy survives in more than 120 roles and in the gentle sadness he carried into every frame. Scatman Crothers, as Turkle. Scatman Crothers was born on May 23, 1910, in Terre Haute, Indiana. At 65 years old, Crothers played Turkle, the sly, sympathetic night orderly who brings both trouble and humanity to the ward, in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, 1975. His warm voice and effortless rhythm made him one of Hollywood's most versatile performers. But beneath the charm was a lifetime of pushing against racial barriers and a final decade marked by devastating illness. His marriage to Helen Sullivan in 1937 was one of the rare interracial unions of its era, a partnership that endured nearly 50 years despite the hostility they faced while traveling for gigs. Their moves between Ohio, California, and Las Vegas were often attempts to escape discrimination that limited where they could perform or even stay the night. Even after he found success in The Aristocats, 1970, and formed a long-standing creative bond with Jack Nicholson through films like The Shining, 1980, Crothers privately carried the exhaustion of decades spent fighting for equal footing in an industry that rarely allowed black actors leading roles. Helen remained his anchor, nursing him through late career fatigue as voice acting became easier on his aging body. By the mid-1980s, the years of smoking caught up with him. Lung cancer spread quickly, eventually reaching his esophagus and leaving him too weak to continue recording voices such as Jazz in The Transformers. He grew bedridden in the final weeks, yet he insisted on working as long as he could, completing episodes even while in pain. Crothers died on November 22, 1986, at his home in Van Nuys at 76, and he was buried at Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Los Angeles. His net worth, around $500,000, came from a lifetime of music, acting, and voice work that broke barriers for black performers in mainstream animation and television. His legacy endures in every character who speaks with warmth, wit, and rhythm. Maria Small, as Candy Star. Maria Small was born in 1943 in Pasadena, California. At 32 years old, she played Candy Star, the soft-spoken, carefree visitor whose brief appearance adds warmth and danger to the ward, in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, 1975. Her role came after early work in Sleeper, 1973, and strong momentum on Broadway, where she originated the role of Frenchie in Grease. But as quickly as the spotlight found her, it began to slip away. Her personal life remained largely private, and without a confirmed long-term marriage, her companions instead were music, stage work, and the circles of artists she collaborated with. As she aged, the absence of major film roles pushed her back towards singing, leading her to form the Small Band and later release her album Do What You Do in 2008. The quieter years that followed exposed the difficult financial stretch many performers face when early promise fades. The stability she found came not from Hollywood, but from local performances and teaching. By the 1990s, she shifted toward activism and local politics, running for office and joining peace assemblies, a change partly driven by the frustration of an acting career that had given her only one major film credit. Her appearance in Man on the Moon, 1999, briefly reintroduced her to audiences, but it did not restart her Hollywood trajectory. Music became her anchor, especially collaborations with Susie Williams, whose shared songwriting helped her navigate the loneliness that accompanied her retreat from the industry. In 2025, she is approximately 82 years old, living quietly and largely away from public view, sustained by occasional creative work and the modest security of a net worth around $500,000 from decades of singing and supporting roles. She remains a gentle, almost vanishing figure in Hollywood history, remembered most vividly for the night she walked into the ward and brought a flicker of warmth to a film that changed cinema. Louisa Moritz as Rose. Louisa Moritz was born on September 25, 1936, in Havana, Cuba. At 39 years old, she played Rose, the bubbly, seductive visitor whose wild energy disrupts the ward, in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, 1975. That performance made her unforgettable to audiences. But behind the bright laugh and platinum blonde charm was a woman who had crossed an ocean and reinvented herself to survive. Her early marriages to William Fine ended quickly, and she lived most of her life without a long-term partner, focusing instead on building a stable existence after fleeing Cuba in 1960. The struggle to establish herself in America left lasting emotional scars, even as success in sitcoms like Happy Days gave her temporary belonging. When she later stepped into law school and rose to the top of her class, the pressure of carrying two careers at once grew overwhelming. The disbarment that followed years later only deepened her isolation, a painful echo of how difficult it had been to build credibility in the first place. Her involvement in the 2017 lawsuit against Harvey Weinstein brought renewed public scrutiny at a time when her health was already fragile. The stress of revisiting trauma compounded the exhaustion of aging, and lingering heart issues worsened after a severe fall during a trip to Washington, D.C. Even as she continued working on real estate ventures and managing her Beverly Hills hotel, the physical strain intensified, and her public appearances became rare. Louisa Moritz died on January 4, 2019, at 82, from cardiovascular complications at a Los Angeles hospital, and she was mourned as both an actress and a lawyer who had rebuilt her life more than once. Her net worth, estimated at around $800,000, reflected decades of acting work, legal practice, and real estate investment, including the Beverly Hills St. Moritz Hotel. Their stories didn't end on screen. They only became more haunting with time. Which actor's journey shocked you the most? If you want more untold Hollywood truths, don't forget to like, subscribe, and tell us who you want to revisit next.